Thank you very much, Sarawania and Melanie, for not just your kind words, but also actually crawling through the report. I know that we're all swimming in reports these days, so I really appreciate that. I will start with some other thanks as well. Thank you, Maria and Kawa Ngamihi Kia Koroa, for your, for supporting this particular project and as well for putting together the event. Much appreciated. I also want to thank Dean Spicer, who's over there, who's the Head of Sustainable Finance at ANZ, who's been a partner of the Climate Innovation Lab, which has been producing these reports. And so thanks to Dean and his colleague Christine Smith as well, who's based in Auckland, who once took a call from this weird academic 5 years ago, wanted to talk about sustainable finance, and it's been a fruitful collaboration since. And also I just want to thank people who were part of the workshop by which we co-design these instruments. So we do go through a process of literature review to look what's out there in the world, and then to try to bring it to the context of Aotearoa New Zealand, both in a bioheritage context, but also a cultural context, and try and make sure that we're not just applying international ideas without adapting them to what's unique about here. I do see Greg over there. Thank you. You're the only one I see from the workshop actually, but there was over a dozen people involved in that. So all of that feedback has made the report much better than it could have been. And also just a shout out to Sam Lindsay, who's the co-author for this report, who's based in Berlin and in a serious lockdown, which fortunately we haven't experienced here. So he obviously can't be here today. So there's all sorts of statistics we can appeal to in regards to where we are in relation to biodiversity and the challenges we face. One which struck me recently comes from another David Attenborough. Today, human beings, along with agricultural livestock, constitute 96% of the mass of all mammals on the planet. And that means all the rest of mammalian life, from elephants to monkeys, whales to otters, amounts to just 4%. And 70% of all birds alive at this moment are poultry, most of them chickens for us to eat. And this proliferation of chicken bones is set to be one of the distinctive geological markers of what some people are calling the Anthropocene. And the other marker will be, the disappearance of the fossil record of many species, which we're set to lose as we sort of gather momentum in what looks to be a mass extinction event created by our economies. Now, some might say that worrying about the diminishment of our biological heritage is mere sentimentalism, and there's at least two ways to respond to that. Firstly, our sentiments are the foundations of human value. They include our sense of awe and wonder at the species around us, and I can only think of my 4-year-old who's just absolutely obsessed with sharks and just draws them constantly. It really demonstrates that kind of just natural fascination with the animals. It also includes our sense of duty, such as the duty for Māori to be kaitiaki and to exercise kaitiakitanga. And if our economic systems are not responsive to these sorts of sentiments and values, then the error really lies with the economy, not our values. It's the economy that ought to be serving human ends and not the other way around. And there's another way to respond to this charge of sentimentalism from the opposite direction, by arguing that actually our biological heritage is intricately tied up with our material interests. Think of the way that species loss is a consequence of dangers that also directly threaten human species, such as climate change and the proliferation of microplastics through the environment. And also think about how the loss of biodiversity and natural habitat contributes to the degradation of environmental functions that our economy relies on, such as water quality and declining pollination. Indeed, we're so used to living with the damage that we often don't even really see it anymore. An analysis that came out in recent days, which caught my eye, was an attempt to price the global economic damage caused by invasive species around the world. And it's set it at 26.8 billion annually. I always take these prices with a fair grain of salt, but a total of $1.28 trillion over the past half century is sort of economic losses caused by invasive species. So, like the proverbial frog in submarine water, we're so accustomed to these costs and damages that we don't always see them for what they are. So this is the kind of, the context, the troubling context in which we've produced this report that we're launching. And indeed, which the Bioheritage National Science Challenge is responding to. And to this report particularly, part of the problem, not the entirety of the problem by any means, but part of the problem is where financial flows are going or not going. Are we investing in nature or not? And so, there was a recent report, which is referenced to in the handout and in our report itself by the Paulson Institute, which estimated globally to meet current needs for biodiversity investment, financial flows into conservation need to reach rates of more than $800 billion annually over the next 10 years. But current rates of funding are 5 to 7 times lower than that, closer to 120, 140 billion. 0.1% of global nominal GDP. And to make matters worse, the OECD has recently estimated that governments globally spend around $500 billion on support and subsidies that is potentially harmful to biodiversity. So private and public decision makers aren't just failing to invest in nature, they're also investing in its destruction. And obviously that needs to change. And the concept of biodiversity finance relates to that change. Biodiversity finance is, as a simple definition, all the financial flows, both public and private, that go toward protecting or creating native biodiversity. And in the same vein, climate finance, which is what we've focused on in the Climate Innovation Lab, is all the financial flows, both public and private, that go towards mitigating and adapting to climate change. And sometimes these different kinds of sustainable finance are aligned. That is, investment contribute to both biodiversity and climate-related outcomes at once. And that's the kind of space we were trying to land this report in. And it's also the space which is occupied by what's commonly being coming to be known as nature-based solutions, where the enhancement of biodiversity and natural ecosystems are used to solve challenges such as climate change. So, that can include the restoration of forests, of riparian habitats, of wetlands, estuaries, mangroves, shellfish beds, kelp forests, coral reefs. These are all actions that can be undertaken to enhance the resilience of landscapes and seascapes, and so provide solutions, nature-based solutions, to the adaptation challenge. They also sequester carbon and deliver other sorts of environmental benefits. And so, just as the climate and biodiversity crises are interconnected, so too can be the solutions. So at this point, I could walk you through the financial instruments that we propose in the paper, but I have a worry that that's getting into the weeds of financial design is probably going to lose some of us. It is a finicky little area. I mean, I could just say, and it's speaking slightly to your point, that I always just think of finance as an enabler. It just enables people to do what, we live in a cash economy. And it can buy you the labour to do the work. It can even buy you the time to do the work voluntarily, or it could buy you the shovels or the seedlings or whatever you need to do the work. So in that sense, finance is an enabler, and it can enable us to undertake our environmental activities and to exercise kaitiakitanga. And that's a point that came through really strongly, I think, in your briefing to the ministers around biological heritage outcomes for Māori and that alignment. So I'm going to skip over the financial instruments and the details. You can ask it already. She can explain them to you. And I want to talk instead just about the wider enabling environment in which finance operates. And I want to be upfront about an issue which I suspect puts many people off when they hear the word sustainable finance. I think for many people, the word finance is just going to conjure up expectations of neoliberal solutions to problems, of the financialization of nature, and especially profiteering from derivatives and securities that have little relationship to the real economy, let alone to the biophysical systems that it relies upon. And I think, to be sure, some of what is happening and is going to happen under that umbrella of sustainable finance is going to fall into this category. I think that's certainly the case. But, as I gave those definitions of biodiversity finance earlier, they're much broader than that. As I said, it includes both private and public sources of money. And if we're talking about public investment into ecosystem restoration, where the benefits aren't easily captured by any single private interest, then we're obviously a long way from the bogeyman of neoliberalism. Similarly, sustainable finance can involve different types of finance. It can be debt, it could be equity, it could be grants. And of course, the last of these grants involve no expectation of repayment or financial returns at all. We're talking here about government subsidies, private philanthropy, research grants for technology and innovation. This isn't characteristic of mere profit seeking, but it is nevertheless a financial flow which falls into this category, and it's even a kind of calculated loss that is designed to produce other kinds of value. So the point I want to make really is that the political economy of sustainable finance is actually wide open, and it's really a matter of design, what form and what tone that takes. The relevant questions are: who's paying? On what grounds are they paying? Is there an expectation of returns? Are these returns merely financial, or do they include social and environmental returns as well? How are the returns distributed? Who are they distributed to, and who are they not distributed to? Who owns the things that are being created or modified by these investments? And sustainable finance can be designed in different ways to produce different answers to these questions. Some of these designs may well be neoliberal. Others will be characteristic of other varieties of capitalism. Others will be characteristic of social democracy and other sorts of public investment. And others may well stem from indigenous frameworks, such as Te Tiriti. And yeah, I'm glad again you picked up on that. There's just some fantastic work going on and some really great research looking at how to integrate mātauranga Māori into the way that things like impact investment and sustainable finance are thought of and practiced. That sort of, I've seen that process happen through the Aotearoa Circle Sustainable Finance Forum, and I think it did enough in that regard actually, but it was an opening for that conversation for some actors who aren't used to engaging with those ideas. Nevertheless, it has to be said that the predominant way of thinking about sustainable finance, the idea of natural capital, is definitely a capitalist way of thinking about it. The clue is in the name. This idea has been around for a long time now, especially through the work of people like Robert Costanza, and the related idea of ecosystem services, which I'm sure many of you in the room will be well familiar with. And it's also part of the Four Capitals approach, which underpins Treasury's Living Standards framework. It's also now had a refresh in the recent report that Partha Dasgupta published in recent weeks for the UK Treasury on the economics of biodiversity. And so I'll just read a little excerpt from that. The natural world is studied in relation to the many other assets we hold in our portfolios, such as the vehicles we use for transport, the homes in which we live, and the machines and the equipment that furnish our offices and factories. But like education and health, nature is more than a mere economic good. Nature nurtures and nourishes us, so we will think of assets as durable entities that not only have use value, but may also have intrinsic worth. Once we make that extension, the economics of biodiversity becomes a study in portfolio management. So the metaphor here is that, we're all investors managing a portfolio and thinking about nature as one of those assets in the portfolio that we're having to juggle and balance and counterbalance with other non-natural assets. I think Descriptor's trying to sort of ride the line here. He's sort of admitting to that sentimentalism for nature. He's not recommending a purely instrumental view, but he's also leaning on this metaphor of portfolio management, which carries certain expectations and a certain attitude toward what sorts of risks and returns are acceptable. I'm not worried at all about the use of metaphor, because I think like all of our political, economic and institutional thinking relies on metaphors. So it's really more a question of, is this a useful metaphor? Is it kind of delivering the sorts of outcomes we want to see? And, I think natural capital can be a useful metaphor, especially for people who are used to thinking financially but aren't used to thinking about how finance relates to nature. They might have never even considered the fiscal implications of how urban green spaces, for instance, and the way that healthy, active communities, mean who engage with those green spaces means reduced public health needs and so avoided public expenditure. It isn't a short straight line between the investment into nature and the return on investment. It's a wiggly line, but it's at least one that people can comprehend if they're coming at this from an accounting approach. But I think one thing with this report and focusing on biodiversity in particular is just it just really shows up some of the limitations of that natural capital concept, because especially if you take that metaphor of capital too seriously and try to impose that on nature, because nature just doesn't play along with the tidiness of the capital metaphor. Nature is just incredibly complex, it's very fluid, there's so much uniqueness and local specificity, it's responsive and reflexive, it changes as you engage with it, and it just resists the effort to be quantified, to be standardized and to be traded. Carbon is actually much easier on that front, and that's why something like the emissions trading scheme is possible to create and to prop up, because you're just dealing with tons of carbon. I mean, there's lots of controversy around carbon dioxide equivalences and all the rest of it, but let's not go down that track. But even if that is a simple version, biodiversity is just way more complicated than that, and just is much more elusive, and the sorts of benefits that you're creating are just much more diffuse and distributed and hard to capture. So, a natural capital approach, is at risk here of not delivering the right outcomes, I think, especially if we take it too seriously. But one of the things that, is really coming out in the literature of critical geography, I've noticed, that is, this sort of idea of the financialization of nature is not a one-way transaction, it's actually a two-way process. There are biophysical realities of nature, there's limits and constraints, and these are forcing finance and economics to change. It isn't just the financialization of nature, there's also the naturalization of finance. And I think this is my optimistic view on what's happening with sustainable finance initiatives around the world, including, I'd say, the Aotearoa Circle Sustainable Finance Forum, which I've been involved in closely as a member of the technical working group for that. That as the finance sector grapples with these parallel crises of climate change and biodiversity loss, it's going to be transformed by the biophysical realities of what we're dealing with. It's probably a too optimistic reading. I think, there's lots of scope still for avoidance of, those realities and delay and greenwashing and path dependency and wishful thinking. But at the same time, I think there's some real genuine and authentic efforts in these initiatives and in these processes to embrace change and to kind of give way to those hard realities of nature. And this is what we're trying to do with the Climate Innovation Lab. Some of the instruments that we've proposed are kind of workable under current conditions, but some of them we've deliberately made much more ambitious and aspirational, precisely because it gives us interesting insights into how we might change the system in order to make those unviable instruments viable and to make them investable. And some of that change is definitely going to need to happen in the finance sector, and the Sustainable Finance Forum recognises that, especially in its identifying that conventional risk and return requirements are an obstacle to the acceleration of sustainable finance, because there's an inherent short-termism to them, which doesn't reflect that kind of long-term nature of natural processes and the long, slow, incremental, cumulative ways that a lot of environmental degradation and environmental regeneration happens. But as the Descriptor review itself is also very clear, governments also have an inescapable role, not only as regulators but also as market makers. For as long as kings and queens have put their heads on coins, which is to say, since the very beginnings of money, the fact of markets has been entangled with the fact of sovereign power. I wasn't sure whether to talk about sovereign power in a sustainable finance talk, but we are in the old government building, so I feel like I've got license to use that phrase. And if you think that markets are going to play a role in addressing these challenges, that shouldn't be understood to mean that government has no role. It means that government has an absolutely necessary role, which it could do well or it could do poorly in creating those markets. And that's why in this report, we discuss one of the major levers that could help here is a biodiversity payment of some type. We currently have a payment for carbon through the emissions trading scheme, but we're seeing the way that is playing out in a unbalanced way in the landscapes, because it's recognising just one value of native ecosystems, the carbon sequestration value, and not the whole host of values that these native ecosystems provide. So, I think there is scope for setting this, rechanging the system through a biodiversity payment through some type. My own preference is a results-based payment where, government pays for demonstrable biodiversity improvements. And, my favourite example of this is the Burren program in Ireland, where farmers are, incentivised and paid to restore biodiversity to their grasslands. The auditors come and check, what sorts of improvements they get, and the farmers get a payment depending on where they are on the scorecard, and they've also got access to a fund to access technologies to make the changes that they need to make. And they can develop these farm plans which are just on 2 A3 pieces of paper, and it's a system which has got a lot of buy-in from farmers, and I can imagine something like that in this context here. So I'll finish on that with this final thought. Finance means to settle, to finish, to close the deal. Indeed, finance and finish have the same Latin root, finis, to end. So how does finance bring about finality? One thing to say is that all good plans and strategies in the world are of no practical worth unless someone invests in delivering the outcomes. Without finance, without investment of some kind, it's going to be unfinished business. And on that note, fin, F-I-N, the end.